Well, the last 2 weeks in Seattle have not been fun. Numerous atmospheric rivers have hit us. We've had flooding. We haven't had a lot of mountain snow, though, because all that water ended up in the rivers. But I want to talk about landslides, because even after the rain threat subsides, the landslide risk will continue for at least a couple days. So I'm joining David Montgomery, UW geomorphologist, who studies landslides and other things for a living. Isn't that right, David?
That's right. We study how the surface of the earth works in geomorphology.
Okay, so you're one of the best people to talk about this with. So let's talk about the last couple of weeks. How bad has it been with respect to landslides? We've seen some, but how terrible has it been?
Yeah, we've had a lot of landslides in the last couple of weeks because the sponge got full of water and the hills are they're at the point where it's very close, where the more rain we get, the more landslides we'll have. The landslides that we had about a decade and a half ago in the southern part of the state when I-5 was closed, there were a lot more of them, more extensive. But this time, the northern half of the state got hammered by them. And so there's a lot of landslides in the Cascades. We had up to almost 2 feet or more of rain in some areas in the Cascades. And simply put, Washington is landslide country. When we get that kind of rain, there's going to be landslides. We're entering that window in the time of year where the more that comes in, the more we're going to get. But the funny thing about those atmospheric rivers is they're kind of narrow bands of rain. So it's not like the whole state's getting the same treatment. It's like a fire hose of rain, coming out of the tropics, and where it hits, we're going to be prone to a lot more landsliding. But this is landslide country, so it's not a complete surprise. The flooding that we've seen recently is record breaking. The landslides aren't quite there yet, but if we keep getting these atmospheric rivers, what we've just had set the stage for further problems.
All right, we'll get into that in a second. First off, I want to explain one of the reasons why we have a big landslide risk after heavy rains. The slopes absorb the water, and that adds so much more weight to the slope itself. That driving force, gravity, is what's pushing it down. Also, you absorb that moisture, you put a whole lot of water in between all those little soil grains. You basically increase pore water pressure under the slope and decrease friction. You decrease the resistive force to landslides. Exactly. So you have more force pushing it down, less force resisting it. Couple that to rivers eating away at the toe of the slope, which is where you get a lot of the support to keep the land from moving. Is there any other factors in play here with respect to our landslides locally?
Well, those are the real big ones. The other one that you didn't mention is forestry practices, and it's well known that the decay of root strength after timber is harvested opens a window of reduced hill slope strength that can accelerate landsliding. And the typical numbers one finds in studies are by a factor of 3 to 10 or so. But that's going to be very site dependent and very dependent on how and when stuff was cut. There's a lot, one of the key things about landslide hazards and mapping from the generalities to specifics of is your backyard going to go, is it's very, very context dependent in terms of what's making up that hillside, how it's been treated, how the vegetation has been treated. As you were saying, whether the toe has been undercut. That's one of the reasons why there are often a lot of landslides along highways, because highways will go in and cut out the toe of a slope, and that can, over time, destabilize things as well. And unfortunately, it sounds like Highway 2 is going to be closed for a while because of this mess.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you have any other information on Highway 2? If you don't right now, that's fine. But did you learn anything else about some of the slides along Highway 2, why they may be special and why this may take a while for Highway 2 to get opened again?
No, I don't have any particular insight into that at this time. I haven't been out to look at that.
Okay. All right. I'm trying to get out there too. It's kind of tough. It's still dangerous. So I think it's going to be tough to get out there. But another thing, burn scarred areas are going to be more susceptible to landslides. Part of the reason, just like you were talking about with trees, those roots anchor the soil in place. So if the trees have been burned down and those roots are basically burnt or decaying, well, you don't have that anchoring force. So those are some of the spots that will also be susceptible to landslides. Can you explain to me a little more why landslide risk continues even days or longer after the rains stop? The risk is going to continue into the weekend and beyond.
Oh yeah, I mean you can think of landslide risk as being a function of not only how much rain comes in a given storm, but how much rain has preceded it to wet the sponge up. And so when you were talking earlier about the pore water pressures and the water getting in and essentially helping to float soils off of slopes and weaken them, that's something where if the soil is already saturated, it doesn't take as much rain to put it over the limit. So if you have a dry sponge, you got to add water to it to wet it up. We're now
Yeah.
at the point where the regional sponge is soaked.
Yeah.
And so you could expect to see more landslides for the same amount of rain for future atmospheric rivers in the next, until the slopes dry out. And there's some rules of thumb in terms of the total volume of rain that's happened in the preceding several weeks and what happens over the course of a few days. So sort of how wet the ground is and then how much of a rainfall hammer comes in. And for places around the Seattle and the Northwest now, we're either close or beyond those kind of thresholds, which
And
means
we can actually look at the chart to kind of get an idea. Long-term range versus recent range, and you were referring to this chart that I'm talking about right now, right?
Yeah, no, the National Weather Service is really good about putting out tracking rainfall and then using the kind of information that the U.S. Geological Survey has developed in terms of how much rain does it take over how much of a period of time to actually start triggering landslides. And there'll be different relationships in different areas, right? You'd have to do it for site specific. We know it rains differently in Seattle than in the mountains. They tend to get more than we do, and the slopes are somewhat adapted to that. But for the graph that you're showing in terms of Seattle now, we have had roughly almost 6 inches of rain so far this month, which in terms of the total amount of rain puts us over the red line. And we've had about half of that, 3 or so inches in the last couple of days, which puts us over the red line in the vertical direction on that graph. So when points get to the right of that red line in the graph, we're in landslide, the time where we should expect more rainfall to be causing landslides. Because
so looking at this, Seattle Tacoma Airport, the general vicinity, we would expect at least some landslides somewhere.
Well, you would expect that sort of in the region that one weather station is meant to kind of serve as a proxy for, which is kind of the greater Seattle area. That we're at the point where it would not be a surprise. You would expect with more rainfall that we may be getting more landslides. Now, the catch is that as the slopes dry out, things are going to be getting harder to trigger more landslides.
Sure.
So the sooner we get more rain, the higher the risk. And if it has a chance to dry out, that risk will decay. But the Weather Service is really good at tracking those kind of relationships. And people can track, their website to try and see, are we across that red line yet for places that are more, most pertinent to where they live.
Okay, so Boeing Field and also Tacoma Narrows, we're closer to the line where they'll be possible, but not quite as likely around Seattle Tacoma International Airport, and then Everett less likely yet at this point. My question from here, how long can it take for the slopes to dry out to the point where we're back to the original state, where you need more rain to actually get that original number of landslides?
It's really sort of a combination. If you had like a 15 days of really dry weather, that 15-day rainfall total is going to be dropping as you go forward. And with the 3-day rainfall, that's where the real intense rainfall sort of comes in. So it's sort of a complex dance of how much rain do you get over what period of time. And the shorter answer is the more we get faster, the worse it is for landslides.
Okay, makes sense. That chart uses 15-day data. So is it safe to say after we make it 15 days, our landslide risk will go back to what it originally was, or will these risks stay with us all the way through winter?
Well, that's where the different kinds of landslides start to come in and influence how we think about it. For this and if we think about landslides as having two basic characters, there's shallow landslides that are pretty much involves just the soil slipping off, so the vegetation, the trees, the soil, but not much in the way of the underlying geology. Then there's the kind of landslides like the Oso landslide, where the whole mountainside goes. And those are deep-seated landslides that involve more than that. Those are ones where it takes longer for the water to filter down to the level of where that groundwater is. For the shallow landslides, you're really just soaking the soil up. But for the deep-seated ones, it's really the deeper groundwater table that's generating the slide. So like the Oso slide, for example, it happened on the first nice day of spring, but it reflected the intense rainfall of the previous couple months. So,
because it takes time for all that water to seep down into the water table, down to that potential failure plane, which is pretty low, right?
Exactly. And so we've even had examples of, late spring and summertime deep-seated landslides after really wet winters. So a lot of it depends on how the geology is plumbed, sort of where the water goes once we lose sight of it and it goes below ground. how far down does it have to go before it hits the water table and how that interacts with the slope. So, but in terms of the typically most destructive landslides we see in Western Washington are these shallow, rapidly moving ones that respond to the 1, 2, 3 day kind of rainfall. So if we have a couple weeks of dry weather, the landslide risk really goes down. Even a few days of dry weather will help, but the sponge takes longer than that to drain.
Yeah. Okay. Especially if it's a clay soil, right?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Holds it in. Okay.
Yeah.
Real quick, one more question. Running out of time here, but can you say anything else about what you'd expect for the rest of the season? Say, February, March, April. Do we have a heightened risk for deep landslides, or is it really too soon to say make such a drastic statement like that?
For the deep-seated ones, I wouldn't raise any alarms yet in terms of this season. If we keep getting a whole lot more rainfall, then yeah, that probability is going to go up.
Okay.
From what I understand, this winter's forecast to be a fairly wet one, so people should be on guard. And if people are worried or curious about their location and the potential for landslides, it's always a good idea to consult a geologist. I'm retired from that. Nobody call me, please. I let my license expire. But tracking the rainfall, that Weather Service site that shows you how much rain, how close we are to the threshold that scientists have documented, indicates when we expect landslides. It's good to keep track of that if one's concerned.
All right, we'll end here. David Montgomery, you rock. That was a geologist.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.